Hello, my name's David Bruce. So thanks to everyone who submitted questions over at Twitter and Instagram and here on the channel. Let's get started. Samuel R. Howard asks, how do you approach dealing with a piece's duration? And do you ever deal with this facet of writing as a focus? I'm thinking about some of James Saunders' extremely short pieces or long pieces like Feldman's piano, violin, viola, cello. It's a great question, and whatever style of music you write, just stop and have a think about how the duration of your music is decided. In most pop and rock, you're going to stick to 3 or 4 minutes, and it seems to get shorter every year. And why is that? Is that because of the constraints of radio? In classical music, new pieces are often 10 to 25 minutes. So the composer Morton Feldman that Samuel mentions once said, "My whole generation was hung up on the 20 to 25 minute piece. It was our clock. We got to know it and how to handle it. As soon as you leave the 20 to 25 minute piece behind in a one movement work, different problems arise." And I certainly fall into that stereotype. I joke with a friend of mine that all my pieces end up being 23 minutes long, however much I try to change that. And of course, a lot of that is to do with the commissions you get and the desires of the concert-going audience. It's interesting, for example, to think that in the orchestral world, the old symphonic length of a piece is much rarer to be commissioned than it was, because that's a sure way to turn an audience off if there's an hour-long piece of unknown music. Most pieces longer than 10 minutes for orchestra these days tend to be concertos, perhaps because there the pulling power of the soloist seems to be enough. Once you move outside of conventional durations, things start to change interestingly. Feldman also said that up to 1 hour you think about form, but after an hour and a half it's scale. So Feldman's piano, violin, viola, cello, which was his last work, is a good example if you want to start exploring his work. It's very quiet and gentle, and it just rocks away for an hour and a half, always changing but only very slightly. It kind of reminds me of wind chimes a little bit. So a piece like this just doesn't sit comfortably in most programming. It has to become an event in itself. It becomes something more like meditation or a religious experience. It's not personally something I've explored very much, but never say never. Lee Reynolds, who is a friend, hi Lee, asks, have you got any advice for young composers about how they can make medium and large-scale compositions sound cohesive as a meaningful whole, rather than just a succession of ideas or gestures that don't have any inevitability or through line about them? That's actually really challenging, because I think you can easily use some kind of technique that you think will give the piece unity, but actually doesn't at all. Or you might use all sorts of disparate techniques and somehow find a way to knit them all together. Working out how to give a piece a sense of unity really comes down to a sense of taste. I'm not sure there's much you can do to teach it. Perhaps the only advice I can give is to try to think what the piece is really about in musical terms. And in particular, think about the implications of the opening sounds or the first sounds that you get going with. What's the thing about it that most excites you? How could you expand that to its fullest expression? Is it the passionateness of the melody? Is it the funkiness of the rhythm? Is it the long-term drive and sense of momentum? Really focus in on whatever that fundamental, crucial aspect is and try to draw everything you can out of it. Mike Collins Dowden asks, why do you think it's so much less common for modern composers to also perform professionally than back in the good old days of Bach and Mozart? Relatedly, what inspired your decision to focus on composition over performance? Well, there are some examples today of composer-performers. Thomas Addis is probably the most successful. Timo Andres in New York is another who has a solid career as a pianist as well as a composer. In the UK, there's Mark Simpson and also Elisa Fiercever, who plays and composes a lot of chamber music. For myself, the grind of practice was something I never found myself able to commit to, and I often felt that I became a composer because of that. But it's strange that there are certain kinds of grind that I'm perfectly happy with. No, that didn't come across right. There's a lot of grind in composing itself, of course, and a lot of grind in preparing YouTube videos, and I'm perfectly fine with both of those. I would even say I enjoy it. There was just something about the monotony of instrument practice that never sat well with me for some reason. More than anything, I wish I'd been able to conduct, because that's a really useful adjunct to a composing career. You can conduct your own pieces, and it allows you to be in touch with performers and the performance itself a lot more. But unfortunately, I found when I tried it, I could either listen to what was going on or wave my arms, but I couldn't really do both at the same time. Avery Bumgarner asks, do you think playing transcriptions or arrangements that weren't approved by the original composer is ethical? He goes on to give the example of Olivier Messiaen, who apparently said that the sax is representative of bad character, but some of his works have since been transcribed for sax. Messiaen there showing off some of the snobbish and borderline racist attitudes to the sax that I talked about in my sax video. I can certainly see the problem for instruments like the sax or, for example, the mandolin. My good friend Avi Avital, who I've featured in a few videos, has the same problem. If he were to stick to just pieces written specifically for his instrument, the repertoire would be pretty limited. I suppose generally speaking it's almost always better when a piece is performed on the instruments it was written for, but I do also think that classical music fetishizes the work of the genius composer and the score a little bit too much. Maybe we should be willing to consider other options. Mahler, for example, told the conductor Otto Klemperer, if after my death something does not sound right, then change it. You have not only the right but the duty to do that. And Mahler himself famously made changes to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, although admittedly those didn't always go down so well. TJ Bohr 765 asks, how to overcome writer's block? Now there are a few tricks and games which I talked about a little in my composing hacks video, but I think you really have to question, what am I afraid of? In most cases, you're afraid of looking foolish, you're maybe afraid of crushing whatever tiny shoots of a career you have, you're afraid of not writing something that's worthy or of a high enough standard. I was actually forced through this process all over again when I started making YouTube videos. It's so easy to think that people will laugh at what you're doing and for paralysis to take over as a result. From my experience, and this is particularly true when you're young, the roads you think are the ones you need to take to build a successful career as an artist are very rarely the ones you end up taking. If you do find success, it will almost always come at you from an unexpected angle. So you really are best advised to just take joy in what you're doing and not have any ambitions for it, at least during the process of creation. I mean, afterwards, by all means, promote it and get it out there. But while you're creating, block off those nagging voices, those naysayers, those senses of how you ought to be doing things, and just focus on what you feel excited to do. I would say if it feels naughty, inappropriate, foolish, childish, you're almost certainly heading in the right direction. Following on from this, Batty asks how to start composing in a serious way rather than writing in an amateur way. Now, in the best meaning, I would say be a serious amateur. A professional is someone who really knows what they're doing, and no good artist really knows what they're doing. They're lost in an exciting, terrifying world that they may never find their way out of. So find something that your amateur self just goes uncontrollably crazy for, and then be deadly serious about pursuing it. Jonathan Ingenhorst asks, have you ever met Adam Neely in person? No, but he did visit me in a dream the other night, which is a worrying sign I'm taking my YouTube a bit too seriously. Although, funnily enough, Adam in the dream was really excited to meet me, so I guess that makes me an arrogant. I will say that there's a big and very exciting collaboration coming up on my channel with several big music YouTubers, including Adam, and I'll be very excited to tell you more about that soon. Paul J. Morton asks, do you personally consider film and video game music that has been originally written for instruments and ensembles that are associated with classical music to be classical music? If not, do you think such music could ever have a place in traditional classical concerts among Beethoven and others? The short answer is yes, I think it could, but the whole question of what is classical music is both kind of boring and also kind of fascinating, and I've thought about it quite a bit, and I've come up with what I think is an answer to it, but I'll save it for a whole video on that topic soon. Isaac Davanzo, who has a nice tuba in his profile, asks, what's your opinion on the tuba? Well, I love the tuba. It's one of the few instruments that really conveys its scale, its size, in its sound. That also is a topic for a whole video, but the tuba has this huge power and sometimes menace to it, which can be very exciting. More tuba, more tuba. Brian Matuski asks, will you be making more orchestral analysis videos like you did with Beethoven's Third Symphony? Yes, I'd love to. I've got a few ideas, but do let me know in the comments which pieces you'd particularly like me to look at. Mick Eggers asks, what are your thoughts on big companies like Sony flagging educational music channels such as Adam Neely? Has it personally affected your videos? Love the videos. So I've only had a couple of demonetizations, no full strikes, mostly for slightly bizarre infringements. So my favourite one was the video I did on silence, where I showed the audience sitting in silence for 30 seconds after the end of a Mahler performance. And that got me demonetized by the owners of the video. I mean, it was a film that someone had made, so I kind of understand, but it kind of made me chuckle that of all the things. The subject of copyright itself is one that I have a massive issue with, and again, that's going to be a future video. So perhaps I'll save a fuller response till then, but I do share everyone's frustration that what should be a fairly simple problem to overcome shows no sign of a solution. Cortland Matthews asks, is there a difference between evoking and manipulating emotion in music? Yes, of course, although it's quite a difficult line to draw. I tend to agree with the British composer Oliver Nusson, who died last year, who said, if the piece turns out to be touching, then the composer has done his job well. If the composer sat down and says, I'm going to write a touching piece, I don't want a dry eye in the house, then I think that's disgusting, it's manipulative. But of course, what one person will view as manipulative, another will find incredibly moving, so it's hard to define. For me, Bach is quite a useful pointer because whatever the setting, even with amateur performers or whatever, his music always stands out for the power of its expressivity. And I often think about how he does that. You certainly never feel manipulated by his expressive lines. I think it's more to do with the way he sets up a certain kind of framework within which expressivity can happen. Nare Sol asks, what instrument do you find particularly difficult to compose for and why? So thanks Nare, and thanks by the way for introducing me to Rick Beato, who I had a lovely time meeting in London a few days ago. I've certainly had battles with various instruments that I've had to get through to find a way to write for them. Until fairly recently, the piano was actually a really big challenge for me. I do like testing out ideas I have on actual instruments, and you might think that would be easy for piano, but I eventually realised that the upright piano, which we can all access, is an entirely different instrument from the concert grand, which is one of the reasons I got this digital piano, which has a really good concert grand sound. And I feel like since I got that a few years ago, my piano writing has improved quite a lot. On the whole, I think it's only a lack of experience that has made any instrument challenging to write for. I can't think of any that I would say, ooh, I'm never writing for that. Can I? No, can I? Philippus Vistamurti asks, as a composer, have you ever felt insecure or not confident about your own compositions? If you have, how do you overcome it? I always feel this about my own composition, although my compositions already have been performed several times, even winning a competition. I ended up hating and not liking my own composition, and I don't know how to overcome this feeling and just be confident about my own composition. I'm kind of more surprised when I meet composers who are like, yeah, I was totally happy with it, it just did everything I wanted it to. I think artists tend to be hypercritical, and it's hard for us not to feel that we haven't come up to the aims we have for our work. So I would tend to find myself more willing to respect you if you were lacking in confidence about your work than if you were brimming with confidence. But also, in my case at least, it has gradually improved over the years. Although if you check out a couple of my premiere vlogs I did early in the channel, you'll see that even now the rehearsal period itself can still be pretty traumatic. Which finally relates to Neroni Proietti's question, what makes a bad composition? So an old friend of mine died recently, and he developed over the years a wonderful theory of the universe. He was trying to find a way to account for existence that was based on current science, that didn't require a god, but that somehow tried to encompass the spiritual aspects of life. So his theory was that before the Big Bang there was a single consciousness, a sort of mental perfection, which was then shattered into fragments in the Big Bang, and exists now in individual consciences across the universe, including in our brains. So our job, he thought, was to gradually recreate that state of oneness. And part of that, he thought, was that any creative act, any organising of mental energy, was a small contribution towards rebuilding the original, nirvana. So for him, any artistic act, even if no one ever saw it or heard it, was an important part of the essential progress of the universe. I just love that idea, and the idea that any artistic creation is essentially good. So, although there's plenty of music that I might at a particular moment not enjoy, I would prefer to see that as a fault in myself rather than the piece. We're all working on rebuilding the universe in our own way. Okay, probably the pieces I'm least comfortable with, and this comes back to that evoking emotion question, are the ones that seem deliberately manipulative or full of fake sentiment. Anyway, if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this Q&A, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, do check out some of my other videos and consider subscribing. Thank you to my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to consider joining them, that would be fantastic. The links are here and here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.